Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the iPad 10th Gen as we head into 2025. This is a tablet that wasn't on my bingo card at all, partly because the original coverage was quite critical and negative, with many folks criticizing Apple for some curious design decisions, as well as, at the time, perhaps wasn't the best value compared to other iPads, considering that the original MRSP was $450. Now, in a vacuum, even that original MRSP wasn't super egregious, I would argue, considering that the 10th gen base iPad finally adopted a more streamlined, modern design language also used on their iPad Pros and Airs. And also, the first few generations of iPads back in the day all debuted at around the $500 price mark, since it is a premium tablet after all. But the biggest issue was comparison, because around the same time, you could pick up something like an iPad Air 4th gen, which actually has the same processor inside as this iPad 10th gen, plus having a slightly better display, which is fully laminated, that made some folks argue you should pick up this instead, not to mention the iPad Air 5th gen, which then rocked a significantly more powerful M1 silicon inside, for give and take $200 more. So perhaps the biggest issue was Apple oversaturated their own product catalog by having so many different tiers and options, making comparisons inevitable. So it all came down to value and pricing, and thankfully over 2 years later a lot has changed. Namely, during the holiday shopping season, this 10th gen iPad, which is still being sold officially by Apple, has been slashed to a pretty ridiculous $280. And if that's not low enough, you can even find it for around $250 if you shop around. So now that this 10th gen iPad is effectively in the $200 price range, I think a lot of those shortcomings are much more palatable, inching closer to what I would consider as more of a budget option for a tablet. With a pretty good screen-to-body ratio, much slimmer bezels compared to when iPads still have Touch ID and a physical home button on the front, such as the 9th gen iPad, this model is definitely more visually attractive, which is pretty crazy for still a relatively modern iPad, which is brand new. Again, the cost now becoming closer to even some Amazon Fire tablets, at least at their original MRSP. But this is why competition is great, because since Apple has reduced the cost of the 10th gen iPad so significantly, other companies have had to do the same in order to compete. Notably, Google with their Pixel tablet has also adopted a similar aggressive strategy of really reducing the price of their relatively premium tablet, and Amazon with their Fire Max 11 that we alluded to earlier, which retails for around $200, has also now been slashed to an even lower price point just to remain competitive. So it's actually a great time to shop around for a tablet. For the first time in a very long time, almost all of these larger companies and brands have re-entered into the tablet space, so you do have more variety to pick between, versus for a moment there it seemed like tablets were on their way out, and really you only had iPads as the sole premium option. So again, competition is always great for us as consumers. Nevertheless, I don't think I've ever seen a new iPad for sale at $250 before, so I had to take a closer look at this one, reevaluating how it performs kind of 2 years later and how it stacks up in terms of value. So briefly starting with the packaging and presentation, irony here is you get more in the box compared to the more expensive Pro Edition iPhones from Apple these days. That is, inside here, aside from the iPad itself, we also get a USB Type-C to Type-C cable, which is braided, as well as a 20-watt USB Type-C wall charger. This is something that we've commented on with budget phones as well, but it's kind of funny how it now applies to Apple as well, where on their more budget offerings you get more in the box compared to some of their $1,000 devices. But certainly nice to find here. You also get a quick start guide, although it looks like one thing that is missing would be the classic Apple sticker. And now, revisiting the design, we have a nearly 11-inch IPS LCD screen, which offers a 2K resolution or 264 ppi. It is indeed very sharp. However, as alluded to earlier, one slight con on this 10th gen base model is like the 9th gen iPad that came before it, it isn't fully laminated. So there is a slight air gap between the glass on the top as well as the LCD underneath, as you can see here. In regular use, primarily indoors, it doesn't bother me at all, and especially since it's now a around $250 tablet, I would say it's an acceptable compromise, particularly since the actual screen itself offers excellent, again, sharpness in addition to colors looking quite vibrant. It is a standard 60Hz refresh rate, but then again, the Google Pixel tablet as well as the Amazon Fire Max 11 tablets, which are all relatively premium from their respective brands, are also standard 60Hz as well. So perhaps in the next gen revision, we'll see all of these companies up it to something like 90 or 120, but it is what it is at the moment. Still feels relatively fluid and fast thanks to the processing package and compute power inside, which, speaking of, is the Apple A14 Bionic chip. This is a 6-core processor, 16-core Neural engine, and Apple fans out there will know that this processor was also used on the iPhone 12 series, so it's definitely no longer the newest on the market. But generally speaking, for casual computing tasks that you're doing on a tablet, I would argue that for 90% of folks out there, it's still more than sufficient. Again, it's a similar situation as on the Google Pixel tablet as well, where they're not using the latest bleeding edge processor per se, but for things like web browsing, multitasking, it all still feels quite smooth, unless you're getting into the more extreme territory for things like video editing, for instance. That's where perhaps the iPad Air 5th generation model that's using the M1 processor will provide a more significant bump. In fact, taking a look at some of the benchmark scores, which aren't always reflective of real-world usage, but still gives us a rough idea, you can see that the M1 chip will have roughly 40% higher CPU mark performance. And single thread performance isn't super far apart, but it's really in the multi-thread performance since it has 8 cores compared to 6 cores on the A14, along with a faster GPU that it becomes a little bit more observable when you are pushing it super hard. But again, you have to be a power user to really feel that difference. iPad Air 5th Gen can now be found for around $400 if you are shopping around. But what's really interesting is that delta, the gap between this and also the M1 iPad being $200 apart, hasn't really changed compared to 2 years ago, where again this thing was around $400 and that one was around $600. I just point that out because now that the 10th gen iPad falls closer to the budget territory, even though it's still only a $200 difference between those two models, it somehow feels more significant because it's almost like you're doubling the price of this to upgrade to an M1 iPad. You can almost squeeze in 2 of these for the cost of one. Another way to look at it would be this is more in the budget range versus I consider $400 and above to still be more in the mid-range or premium section. So if you are on a tight budget, or if you're using your tablet in a more casual way, which honestly I think encompasses the vast majority of folks out there if you already have a more powerful laptop or desktop for doing more serious productivity work and you're using just a tablet for media consumption, watching videos, and web browsing, then a base model iPad can honestly still be more than good enough. That being said, there are 2 software features that you technically have to upgrade to an M1 iPad with at least 8 GB of RAM to unlock. One of them is going to be Stage Manager. This allows you to have slightly better multitasking capability by switching back and forth between open windows. So if you're connecting your iPad to a mouse, for instance, it's going to feel closer to using a computer. But keep in mind that iPadOS, even though the UI elements here are improving, it was still designed originally as a mobile operating system. So this is a nice to have UI feature similar to Samsung DeX or desktop mode on their Galaxy Android powered tablets. But keep in mind that not all the apps that you're running are truly desktop class compared to their macOS or Windows equivalents. You can use this as an excellent quality external or portable display, or again remote desktop into an actual Windows or macOS computer, but that isn't necessarily the same thing as running those desktop applications locally. If you are disconnected from the internet or you don't want to deal with latency, just keep those things in mind. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is even though it would have been nice to have Stage Manager support, it might not be a deal breaker necessarily if you don't expect your iPad to be a true laptop or full computer replacement. It still is more meant as a hybrid device, something that fills the gap between a mobile device as well as a full-blown desktop class device like a laptop, for instance. Now the second feature that technically this A14 iPad is missing would be support for Apple Intelligence, which is some of their newer AI features scattered into iPadOS, including native support for ChatGPT, some of the summarization and reworking of your messages, as well as email features you are not going to be able to get in this slightly weaker processing package. But once again, I would argue it's not a huge deal breaker, primarily because you can still download third-party AI tools if you really want to use them. For instance, the ChatGPT app, Google's Gemini app, not to mention Microsoft's Copilot app, Perplexity are all examples that you can use directly on this iPad, granting you free access to 80, if not 90% of the features when it comes to summarizing as well as generating things. Even if it isn't natively built directly into the OS, you can still get a taste for what some of those generative AI features are like just by downloading many of these free apps. Now, as far as some other features are concerned, the iPad 10th gen, just like the 9th generation, does support Apple Pencil, but it has to be the first gen model. This is where some controversies struck originally because the first gen Apple Pencil charges using a Lightning port carried over from legacy Apple products, whereas the iPad 10th gen finally adopts again the standard USB Type-C port. So it meant if you wanted to charge your Apple Pencil using the iPad, you had to get a USB Type-C to Lightning adapter, and it was kind of an awkward situation, particularly when compared to the Apple Pencil 2nd gen, which added support for wireless charging just by docking it onto the top of the iPad, was a lot more elegant. Apparently that feature didn't make the cut because Apple repositioned the webcam to be on the horizontal axis, calling it center stage. It's slightly better for video conferencing, and using some software features, it will track your face as you're moving around, kind of zooming in on you, which is great for FaceTime, Zoom communication, particularly during the COVID era. But because of this module, it would interfere with the wireless charging component, which is a little bit of a shame. But if you're not someone that is actively using a stylus to draw, I would honestly say it's perhaps not a huge deal breaker, especially since you could always charge the Apple Pencil using a power bank or at home and then just use it with a tablet when you're trying to write or doodle, instead of charging your pencil using the tablet's battery. I mean, yes, a more seamless integration would have been great, but I would rather have USB Type-C on here and have a slightly more awkward Apple Pencil setup as compared to having a Lightning on the iPad, because USB Type-C here allows us to connect to much more standardized third-party accessories. For instance, you can easily connect it to an adapter hub to connect a wired keyboard and mouse, in addition to thumb drives for dragging and dropping files over. Not to mention that this iPad also supports video output using this full-spec Type-C. So you could connect to external displays, as well as AR video glasses, allowing you to watch back videos more comfortably if you are traveling, for instance, with more privacy as well, which is really convenient. The irony is the Google Pixel tablet and many of the previous gen Google Pixel phones did not support display output using that Type-Cs. Compared to the iPad 10th gen here, gives you that flexibility. So it is what it is. I get that for graphic artists out there, and if you are note-taking every single day with your iPad, then it might be a slightly bigger con, but at least there is support for a pressure-sensitive active stylus pen on a base edition iPad, which is still neat to have. And also, if you don't necessarily need pressure sensitivity, many of these third-party pens, for instance, are only a couple of bucks and can still be a decent enough experience if you are taking very light notes, or if you're not a serious artist, for instance, it can be sufficient. So that is the stylus situation at this point in time. Now you can also tell that on the bottom here of the iPad there are 3 Pogo magnetic contact pins, because you can snap it onto a folio keyboard case that Apple also sells. And that provides also a trackpad at the bottom as well, kind of converting it into a pseudo laptop or MacBook, but again, still using a mobile-oriented operating system at the end of the day. But you can also pick up third-party accessories quite easily these days. Many of these Bluetooth keyboards will work just fine, popping it up here, and also connecting to something like a Bluetooth mouse for a fraction of the cost if you are more casual when using your tablet in this particular way. Still, it's pretty cool that you technically have support for many of those convertible modes and accessories, even with this base edition iPad. And also comes in pretty vibrant looking colors that I am a fan of. For instance, this blue one, there's also one here in reddish pink, as well as a very vibrant yellow and a more traditional silver as well. A couple of other hardware features that you'll find on here include a fingerprint scanner that is integrated with the power key here. So Touch ID, it remains quite responsive, accurate, and fast. Plus you also have stereo speakers like most larger tablets out there. There are 4 grills, but technically only 1 speaker at the bottom and 1 at the top. So if you accidentally cover up one of the grills, audio can still come out. Although a 3.5mm headphone jack is no longer found on this iPad, which is a little bit of a shame, since I find it hard to believe they couldn't find the space on a 11-inch tablet, but you can always use Bluetooth for wireless headphones, AirPods, if you choose. Also, even though some of the more floating window multitasking capabilities are reserved for the M1 iPads, you can still do some simple split-screen multitasking even on a base model like this. So here's one example of running kind of two windows here side by side, and it still remains a relatively smooth and responsive experience, which is honestly expected from an iPad at the end of the day. Rearranging these windows here kind of snaps into place almost instantly. In fact, the A14 Bionic chip is advertised by Apple to still be capable enough of editing 4K videos. It's just the render time when you're outporting those files will be slower compared to an M1 iPad, but honestly, it still is a pretty fast tablet, all things considered. Also, the cameras on here are not shabby. Now, you might be thinking, who would use a camera on a tablet? Well, for purposes like document scanning can still be helpful to have, and they are capable of 4K video recording as well. Might be a little bit overkill on a tablet, but there we have it. It's the same 12 megapixels on the front as well as on the rear, although you don't have an LED flash on the back, which is kind of an interesting omission, so darker environments may struggle a little bit more. This, what looks like a flash, is actually just a microphone. Other connectivity options include built-in Wi-Fi 6 support, as well as an optional cellular model that comes with up to 5G connectivity when you're away from home. However, keep in mind that, again, the $250 base price tag applies to the Wi-Fi only model, which, by the way, comes with 64 gigabytes of built-in storage along with 4 gigabytes of RAM. So 64 gigs of built-in storage might be a little bit low for some folks, considering that iPhones and iPads don't have a micro SD card slot for more easily expanding the storage that way. But like we said, because it is now using standard USB Type-C, there's nothing stopping you from plugging in a USB thumb drive or an external SSD like this one if you want to sideload some of the content and back it up, or rely on cloud storage. Alternatively, if you are more light on your usage, primarily just for streaming back videos, browsing the web, it can still be perfectly fine. Interestingly though, the next tier up would be the 256 gigabyte model. There's really nothing in between, like a 128 gigabyte version, which is a little bit curious. Perhaps that would be the default in the next generation revision. Like all iPads that have come before it, it's milled off a single chunk of aluminum alloy, and because it is slightly thicker compared to the iPad Airs, you have something that feels a little bit more substantial as well when you're holding onto it. It doesn't really bend or flex. It is cold to the touch, and I am a fan of these very squared off edges and corners. Definitely looks quite sleek. Really, the only other hardware feature on here would be just the volume rocker, which is also etched out of metal. Now, something that I find to be a little bit interesting about the volume control compared to on Android devices is that depending on the orientation that you're holding onto the tablet, the up and down buttons also will change dynamically. For example, in this portrait mode, I can tap on the top key to raise the volume higher, bottom here to lower the volume as expected. But now if I flip it into the horizontal orientation, instead the bottom key here will be corresponding to raising the volume higher, and then the top key here will be making it lower. That might be the one hardware aspect that required the biggest acclamation coming from an Android user. After a while, it makes sense though, because regardless of what angle or position that you're holding onto the tablet, it's always relative to your current position. Now, other controls, similar to past-gen iPads, which still had a home button on the middle, you could long press on the power key for a few seconds to activate Siri for voice control, as well as the power plus the volume down key to capture a screenshot. And to Apple's credit, again, over the past few generations of their OS updates, they've started to unlock more and more flexibility in their OS, which users have been asking for. For instance, the ability for you to stack widgets together as cards, as well as now having kind of a consolidated app tray or drawer of their own by swiping all the way here onto the right to search up the app library, for instance. It's a nice consolidated way of quickly finding all of the applications on the tablet and some quick cards here on the left of the home screen. So a lot of these UI elements have been polished to perform quite well on a tablet form factor from Apple's part. Point being, although it's kind of easy to hate on Apple for perhaps overpricing some of their products, now that you can get an iPad like this in the, again, $200 price range, which is kind of insane, I have to admit that from the perspective of just consistency, I can definitely understand why the iPad has been such a popular tablet and has become almost the standard in a way. Not to mention, you do get Apple's excellent reputation when it comes to privacy. You can be quite certain that they aren't really selling your data, unlike many brands out there. In fact, even if the FBI required them to hand over your Apple ID information, Apple's stance is really saying no. So from the perspective of computer security and data privacy, I guess that is one other advantage of being in the Apple ecosystem. Now, one other potential concern that some folks may have picking up the iPad 10th Gen, even though it's still the current generation base iPad being officially sold, is how much longer will it be supported for? Since this iPad debuted actually at the end of 2022, so now it's approaching 2 years old. And that is kind of fitting because we are now seeing that $200 discount in price, but I think it's still a pretty good moment when we look at the lifespan of the tablet as a whole, just because Apple tends to have a very good track record when it comes to software support, typically lasting around 5 to 7 years and up. And that means at worst, you should still receive 3 years up to 5 years of continued software support if you're picking one up at this point in time. Now that's kind of crazy because many companies out there won't even provide 5 years of software support for a brand new model that just came out. And so for the foreseeable future, when it comes to, again, privacy, security updates, OS updates, you should be perfectly fine. One can argue, though, that as the iPad OS and iOS as well continues to balloon with even more features, it tends to require more computational power to drive. Areas like the GPU as well as RAM will be further tested as we approach the end of the product's lifespan. But all I can say is 2 years in, and this 10th gen iPad still feels very fluid and fast when it comes to just navigation, really without missing a beat, as you can tell here, going back and forth between these apps, still feeling incredibly smooth and responsive. So at some point, maybe that will start to catch up, and for future proofing, that's perhaps one argument to pick up an M1 iPad, but for those on a budget, it's still, again, the difference between really an entry-level model versus more of a mid-ranger. Other standards include a built-in compass, GPS, as well as accelerometer, barometer, light sensor can all be found on the hardware here. Now, if we take a closer look at the USB Type-C port, again, it is capable of driving external displays, in addition to data and charging, although it's technically USB 2.0 speeds, perhaps on purpose, as one reason to upgrade to more of their expensive models, so up to 480 megabytes per second. This is one aspect where the read and write speed might feel a little slower, so it's an area where hopefully we'll see that bumped up to USB 3.0 across the board, moving beyond this point. Last but not least, when it comes to the battery on here, it is a 28.6 watt-hour cell, and one advantage of the Apple A14 Bionic chip is it is a little bit more battery efficient compared to the Apple M1 and M2 iPads. This thing sips power in battery drain tests and tends to rank first along Apple's current collection of iPads. It can last anywhere between 9 to 10 hours of continuous video playback as well as light web browsing when using the display around 30 to 40% brightness levels. So in most cases, it should last you for around 2-3 days of continued usage unless you are binging an entire season of TV on a flight, for instance, but even so, battery life has been quite impressive, considering it is a full-sized 11-inch screen, which is pretty sharp at 2K. Give and take around 2 hours to fully juice up a larger battery in here compared to on a smartphone. So in general, when it comes to endurance, this 10th gen iPad still is excellent. In fact, because you can get this brand new compared to, say, an iPad Air 4th gen, which at this point will likely be refurbished or used condition, will likely see more degradation in the battery health. So if you want the battery life to last as long as possible and you're not perhaps comfortable with getting a used unit, then that is also one area where, again, the 10th gen iPad may have an advantage in. Now, taking a closer look at how it performs using some more specific apps like web browsing next, let's try to load up some more demanding pages like The Verge. And as you can tell here, it still is going to be a super fast and responsive experience. A14 Bionic, again, for casual computing tasks, more than zips along just fine. Let's also try loading up another site including CNET, and as you can tell here, still is going to be super fast. Now, one can argue that maybe the sweet spot when it comes to ultimate portability, though, might be somewhere in between. Something like an iPad mini, for instance, which is closer to a novel in size, might actually be my preferred or ideal form factor when it comes to travel. It's still larger compared to a phone for it to be a noticeable difference when it comes to reading and web browsing, but also going to be lighter on your hands if you're holding it for hours on end. But the funny thing is the most modern looking iPad mini with a similar slim screen to body ratio hasn't received as many discounts as this iPad 10th gen. In other words, you have to spend around $100 to $200 more for a new model that has a smaller display. And so sadly, the value of iPad minis, just in my opinion, isn't quite as strong at this particular point in time since this thing is now so cheap. So just something to keep in mind. You can obviously augment this with a kickstand or again pop it onto one of those keyboards to just make it more comfortable if you are reading or looking at videos for longer durations. Let's also move into a quick video consumption as well as speaker test next. So turning things down, takeaway is, again, Apple's speaker quality tends to be excellent, and this is thankfully no exception. It's far richer sounding and louder than you'll expect out of a tablet at the end of the day. Definitely is higher quality, I dare say, compared to the Google Pixel tablet, which is a little bit more tinny and muted sounding by comparison. I think Apple is making great use of the extra space inside, using it as a chamber there to kind of reflect the acoustics, because the result is you get much more spacious sound than you'll think out of something that is still relatively compact at the end of the day. It's great for, again, consuming videos, watching them back on YouTube, Netflix. It's still very enjoyable. Thanks to the excellent sounding speakers. There is support for picture-in-picture mode for a little bit of additional multitasking as well. And again, when it comes to buffering and loading up these video clips, still remains really fast and fluid, even though right now we are currently at the 2K resolution. And now taking a closer look at the aforementioned keyboard and mouse situation. UI-wise, we do have support again for a mouse cursor point that also kind of snaps into place whenever you approach one of the other icons, as you can tell there, making it a little bit easier to hit icons which might be slightly smaller. I will say though that when it comes to swipes and gestures, it does seem like Apple's own Magic Trackpad tends to be the smoothest and most responsive. So if you're looking at third-party options like, ironically, this one here from Microsoft does also have a trackpad support at the top. It can be a slightly more of a janky experience, but technically, yes, you can still swipe up and down, navigate left and right using swipe gestures, as you can tell there. You have to be a little bit more deliberate in some of your motions, but technically works, though the touchscreen still feels the most responsive and smooth for some reason. Taking a quick look here at their camera app, the UI is pretty familiar compared to on iPhones, and you do have the ability to have a digital crop on your images up to 2 times, but it's not really a telephoto lens, but still does the job. For the purposes of document scanning, it's more than good enough, and the ability for it to actually flatten out images as well, if they are slightly skewed when you are looking at a book, for instance, can be quite helpful. Generally speaking, images are extremely fast to focus and snap with minimal delay, and you can also still crop in and see plenty of detail. Colors are also very accurate, as expected from an Apple product. HDR is also helping in retaining some of the details within the shadow regions. For a tablet, it is definitely above average quality. Now, some of the other utility tools that you have built on in, including translation app, clock app, weather app, again, these are all standard from Apple, in addition to finally, in one of the latest iPadOS updates, the calculator app. Not sure to laugh or cry, but it's been kind of a running joke that it's taken us over 10 years to finally get a first-party calculator app from Apple. And I don't know, I guess one of the rationales that Apple had for delaying this so long was saying it looked janky or weird when stretched on a larger screen, but I honestly don't really think that situation has changed much because it still looks quite large, almost comically so, on this default view. I guess one benefit is you can type really quickly, but at the very least it is now finally here on this latest edition of the iPadOS. So we're not going to go over all these apps one by one, but the point is you do have access to Apple's equivalent of music playback, streaming tools, as well as, again, Safari being their web browser of choice. But since the App Store is here, there's nothing stopping you from downloading alternatives like Chrome, as well as Firefox, if you choose to do so. And it goes without saying that reading back books, as well as comics, PDFs, remains a really enjoyable experience with this excellent display, which is also the reason why iPads have been pretty popular across educational institutions and schools. So it can be a great tool for looking at any textbooks, for instance, on such a large screen, plenty of space here for annotation. Flipping the screen around for our two-column view instead, if you prefer, all looks quite good. And speaking of schools, one rationale that Apple had for choosing a non-laminated screen is perhaps for repairability. Let's say a younger kid drops the iPad and then cracks the glass on top, it's going to be a lot cheaper to replace only the top layer of the glass as compared to on a fully laminated screen where the display underneath is also glued to the glass and you have to replace both of those components. For instance, costing $50 to repair the glass compared to hundreds if you have to swap out the entire display stack can be much more expensive. So again, that trade-off when it comes to repairability and durability might also be one factor. Here's also one quick example of a comic book that we are looking at. So as you can tell here, it still is going to be plenty sharp as well as nice looking when it comes to colors, quite enjoyable. This is one area where the larger screen of an 11-inch iPad here will shine. One other gesture that you can access in iPadOS, by the way, is this little dot here at the top. If we actually drag down for a couple of seconds, we are able to access the multitasking view. It's a pretty nice gesture that works well enough. So now we have, for example, freeform here on the side for jotting down additional notes, in addition to the book here on the right, and both are still running really without any problems. Again, some of the final defaults that you'll find here include their versions, basically, of Excel as well as PowerPoint in addition to Word, so you can edit those documents, check out your emails, getting some of that productivity work done if you choose to do so, as well as downloading additional apps, including Google Docs, if you want to go that route. Again, point being that interacting with all of these utility tools still feels quite fast and fluid. Really nothing from the store that you can't download if the memory allows you to do so and still run pretty well. And that includes the aforementioned third-party AI apps, including even the standard Google app now has some built-in AI features, including Google Lens support, scanning in objects or searching them up, as well as recognizing what is being displayed on the screen directly. And speaking of downloading some additional apps, let's do a quick demo of gaming here. This is NFS No Limits. Now, the middle section of the tablet, as you're pressing it harder for more than, say, 30 to 40 minutes, may get a little bit warmer, but the top and bottom regions that you're holding onto are still relatively cool in terms of thermals, and I never really encountered too much thermal throttling per se. Performance was still quite stable and consistent, thankfully, when it comes to running the duration of the gameplay session. So the takeaway there is, even though it's not going to be as performant as an Apple M1 or M2 iPad, obviously, I would argue that some of those tablets might also be a little on the overkill side, considering it's the same processor also found on their flagship laptops and desktops, with more professional tools taking advantage of that power compared to on a mobile platform like this. This is still going to give you a perfectly serviceable experience, particularly if you're more of a casual gamer anyways. Then using something like this is still not going to really get in the way of you enjoying some of these titles, social media tools, so on and so forth. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited closer look at the iPad 10th generation model. And this is a pretty crazy story of a wild turnaround, just because when it first debuted, pretty much all the public opinion about this tablet was overwhelmingly negative. Even though it introduced this modern design language on their most base edition iPad, from a value perspective, it seemed like other offerings within their lineup might have been a little bit more attractive at the time. But fast forward 2 years later, and wow, things have definitely changed now that this is squarely in the budget territory that still performs really well and looks beautiful from a design perspective. Many of those shortcomings are just so much easier to swallow and forgive. The basics here are handled quite well. It still offers more than enough compute performance to feel really smooth when you're interacting with the tablet, paired with excellent speakers as well as pretty long-lasting battery life as well. So it is still an excellent tablet, particularly now in the budget segment. So here's something I never thought I would say, but this 10th generation iPad is actually a great value. Goes to show that, again, price and context is really important. Could actually be an interesting alternative to something like a Chromebook even. And again, another interesting application would be using it as an external display for a Mac, laptop, or desktop, just by popping it onto the side there, connecting it wirelessly. So anyways, this is a great gateway, I would say, into the Apple ecosystem if you're looking for a very consistent tablet experience that has been the 10th generation iPad revisited.